My name is Claire Thompson. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like easy, reliable, and low maintenance. The kind of person people trust to handle things quietly, the kind they don't worry about checking on too closely. I live alone, I work a steady job, I don't raise my voice, and I don't share much unless I'm asked. If you met me briefly, you might assume I've lived a fairly uncomplicated life. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth a story this long. That assumption is part of why this happened the way it did. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or humiliating them or winning some imaginary argument years too late. It's a story about what happens when accountability is replaced by gaslighting and how quiet people respond when they finally realize the rules were never going to be fair. Several years ago, my parents took my savings to help the family. That's the phrase that was used. It sounded temporary, responsible, almost noble. What followed wasn't a financial dispute, it was a psychological one. Because when I later asked questions, when I tried to clarify what had happened, they denied it ever occurred. Not partially, not different from how I remembered. They denied it completely. This story follows the emotional arc of that realization. Not the moment itself, but everything that came after. The subtle shifts, the recalculations, the way silence stopped being something I defaulted to and became something I chose. You won't hear shouting here. There are no explosive confrontations or dramatic ultimatums. What you'll hear instead is the slow understanding of how roles are assigned inside families, how some people are valued for their usefulness rather than their presence, and how easily truth can be rewritten when the person holding it is expected not to fight back. I'm telling this now because time has done its work. Enough distance has passed that I can speak clearly without needing to defend my emotions or exaggerate them. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not even asking you to agree with every decision I made. I'm only asking you to listen to how it felt from the inside, to be dismissed so calmly that it almost sounded reasonable. This is a story about restraint, about documentation, about the quiet kind of dominance that doesn't announce itself, but still changes the outcome permanently. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize something familiar. Not in the details, but in the pattern, because many of us have been underestimated by the people who knew us longest. Have you ever realized, much later, that the moment you were most hurt was also the moment you stopped being seen? For most of my life, I was the easy one. That's how my parents described me to relatives. That's how decisions were made around me. If there was something uncomfortable to discuss, something that required patience or something no one else wanted to handle, it naturally fell to me, because I wouldn't make it harder. I didn't push back. I didn't dramatize. I adapted. Growing up, I learned quickly that being low friction made life smoother for everyone else. My siblings were louder, more reactive. They argued, negotiated, and demanded explanations. I watched all of that and decided, quietly, that I didn't want to be a problem anyone had to solve. So I became reliable. I paid attention. I remembered dates. I helped without being asked. I listened more than I spoke, and when I did speak, I chose my words carefully. Adults praised that. Teachers loved it. My parents leaned on it. What no one ever said out loud, but everyone behaved as if it were true, was that my calm made me expandable. If I was disappointed, it was assumed I'd get over it. If something felt unfair, it was assumed I understood why. If I was left out of a decision, it was assumed I trusted their judgment. I didn't throw tantrums, so there was no urgency to explain things to me. I didn't demand reassurance, so it wasn't offered. Over time, that created a very specific version of me in their minds. Someone who didn't need much, and therefore couldn't lose much. By the time I was an adult, that version had solidified. I was the daughter who would be fine, the one who didn't need protecting, the one whose life was steady enough to absorb small shocks without complaint. When I moved out, got a stable job, and lived within my means, it only reinforced that image. They saw independence. They didn't see caution. They saw maturity. They didn't see how closely I tracked everything: money, conversations, promises. What they especially didn't see was that my quiet wasn't emptiness. It was containment. When family conversations happened, I often sat slightly outside the center of them. Not excluded exactly, just not essential. Plans would be discussed that involved my time or resources as if my consent were a given. Claire won't mind. Claire understands. Claire's good with that. And I was, until I wasn't. But even that line, until I wasn't, came much later. At the time, I still believed that being seen as dependable was a form of respect. I believed that being underestimated was safer than being scrutinized. I believed that if something mattered enough, someone would ask me directly. That belief shaped how I behaved when the request about money came. It's important to understand that, because from the outside, it might look like a single decision, one transfer, one conversation. From the inside, it was the natural conclusion of years of conditioning. I was the one who saved quietly, who didn't talk about it, who didn't announce milestones. I had learned early that sharing too much invited opinions, and opinions invited control. So my savings were invisible by design. Invisible things are easy to reperceive. When my parents framed it as helping the family, it didn't sound like theft. It sounded like responsibility finally being acknowledged, like trust, like my steadiness had been noticed after all. What I didn't realize yet was that they weren't seeing me. They were seeing a role that didn't include questioning, memory, or consequences. To them, I wasn't someone who would later say, "That hurt me." I was someone who would quietly absorb it and move on. That was who I was to them. And for a long time, I played that part so well that even I forgot there was another option. The first time it happened, it didn't register as betrayal. That's important to say, because people often imagine moments like these as sharp and obvious. Raised voices, clear boundaries crossed, a before and after you can point to. This wasn't like that. This was small, polite, almost reasonable. It came wrapped in reassurance. My parents didn't sit me down formally. There was no heavy pause before the conversation. It happened in the kitchen, casually, while something was simmering on the stove. My mother mentioned that things were a little tight right now. My father followed with a comment about how families sometimes need to support each other. They didn't ask directly at first. They talked around it. They mentioned unexpected expenses, someone else's mistake, a short-term gap. They spoke as if the solution already existed and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. I remember nodding along, listening carefully, doing mental math, not because I felt pressured, but because this was familiar territory. I was good at filling gaps. When the request finally came, it was framed carefully. They didn't say loan, they didn't say take, they said help. Just for now, just until things settled, just until the family was steady again. And then came the line that made it feel safe. "We know you're responsible." That word, responsible, landed softly. It always had. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked a few clarifying questions. How much? For how long? What the plan was? The answers were vague, but delivered with confidence. And underneath all of it was the unspoken assurance that this wasn't something I'd later need to defend, that this was understood, mutual. I remember thinking, they wouldn't forget this. I remember thinking, they wouldn't deny it. I remember thinking, this is what trust looks like. The transfer itself was quiet. No paperwork, no written agreement, just a confirmation number and a mental note. I didn't announce it to anyone else. I didn't even mark it dramatically in my records. At the time, it felt temporary enough not to deserve a ceremony. What surprised me wasn't what happened next, but what didn't. There was no follow-up, no acknowledgement beyond a brief thank you, no check-in. Weeks passed, then months. If I hinted at it indirectly, the response was light. Things are still complicated. You know how it is. Always vague, always reasonable. And then one day, I brought it up plainly. Not emotionally, not accusingly, just a simple question about timing, about when things might be settled enough to talk about returning the money. The shift was subtle, but immediate. My mother looked confused, not thoughtfully confused, but disrupted, as if I'd referenced a detail that didn't belong in the scene. My father frowned slightly and said, "What are you talking about?" At first, I thought he meant the specifics, the amount, the timeline, so I clarified. And that's when he said it. That never happened. It wasn't said defensively. It wasn't said angrily. It was said with certainty, calm, almost dismissive, as if I'd mixed up a memory or misunderstood a conversation. I laughed reflexively, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. I assumed this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself once I explained, but it didn't. Instead, the explanation shifted again. Maybe I'd offer. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Each version gently moved the responsibility away from them and placed it somewhere hazy, somewhere that didn't require correction. No one else in the family reacted. No one stepped in. No one said, "Wait, that's not how I remember it." And that was the first small cut, not the money, the denial. The moment I realized that my memory could be erased simply by being inconvenient, and that no one felt the need to protect it. I didn't confront them then. I didn't escalate. I told myself it was confusion, stress, miscommunication, but something had shifted. Not loudly, just enough to be noticed. After that first denial, I didn't walk away. I adjusted. That's what I'd always done. Made internal corrections so the external world didn't have to change. I told myself the moment had been mishandled, that stress had blurred things, that if I stayed calm, clarity would return on its own. It felt mature to give it time, so I did what quiet people often do when something feels wrong but not yet dangerous. I minimized it. I reframed the denial as confusion. I reminded myself that families are complicated, that money conversations can be messy, and that intent matters more than precision. I stopped bringing it up directly, but the pattern didn't stop. It spread. Small comments started to land differently. If I referenced something from the past, I'd hear, "That's not how I remember it." If I mentioned a prior agreement, it became, "You're reading too much into that." Nothing aggressive, nothing overt, just gentle rewrites of reality delivered with enough confidence to make hesitation feel irrational. At first, I met those moments with explanation, then with silence. Silence was easier. Silence didn't risk conflict. Silence kept the peace intact, and I had spent most of my life believing that peace, any peace, was worth protecting. What I didn't realize was that each unchallenged dismissal made the next one easier. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about how my version of events carried less weight by default, how my recollections required verification, while theirs were accepted without question. How often the phrase, "you're sensitive," appeared, as if perception itself were a flaw. I started to notice how decisions were discussed around me instead of with me, how assumptions were made about my availability, my patience, my forgiveness. It wasn't malicious. That almost made it worse. It was habitual. And habits don't apologize. There was a particular moment, small, almost forgettable, that crystallized this for me. A family conversation where a past incident came up casually. I corrected a detail gently. Just a date, just a fact. My mother waved it off and said, "You always remember things differently." The room moved on. No one asked what I meant. No one paused to consider the correction. The dismissal was seamless, practiced. I remember sitting there, realizing something with a strange sense of calm. This isn't temporary. This isn't about stress or confusion or time. This is the role I've been placed in, the one whose memory is flexible, whose boundaries are negotiable, whose contributions are invisible once absorbed. And still, I didn't confront them. Part of me believed that if I stayed reasonable long enough, reason would be rewarded. That if I remained calm, the truth would eventually reassert itself. That accountability would appear on its own, like balance restored after a disturbance. Another part of me, quieter but growing, was already observing. Not reacting, just noting. I started remembering conversations more clearly. Not emotionally, structurally, who said what, how things were framed, which words were used when responsibility needed to disappear. I didn't announce this change. I barely acknowledged it to myself. From the outside, nothing about me seemed different. I was still helpful, still composed, still the easiest person in the room. Inside, something had shifted from trust to awareness. I stopped expecting validation. I stopped assuming shared memory. I stopped believing that being good would be enough to be treated fairly. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition without consequence. Through silence that looks like consent. Through roles that harden while no one is watching. By the time I realized how far it had gone, the question was no longer, why are they doing this? It was, why am I still allowing it? And that question didn't demand an immediate answer. It just waited. The clearest realization didn't come during an argument. It came during a moment of efficiency. A family issue came up. Logistical, inconvenient, emotionally charged. Plans needed adjusting. Someone had to step in, reorganize, smooth things over. Before I was even fully aware of the conversation turning, all eyes shifted toward me. Not with urgency, with relief. No one asked if I could handle it. No one checked whether it disrupted my life. It was simply understood that I would take care of it, because that's what I did. That's what I had always done. And in that moment, I saw the role clearly. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't the one who needed to be persuaded. I was the stabilizer. The person who absorbed fallout, who filled the gaps, who kept things running quietly in the background, while others remained central, visible, and emotionally protected. I realized then that my earlier confusion about the money, about the denial, about the shifting narratives, wasn't because the situation was unclear. It was because I had misidentified my position within it. I wasn't being treated unfairly by accident. I was being treated according to my role. In that role, my resources were communal, but my needs were individual. My memory was optional. My discomfort was negotiable. My silence was assumed. It explained why accountability felt unnecessary to them. Why did denying my experience not trigger guilt? Why the idea that I might withdraw or even remember differently seemed almost absurd. The role depended on my consistency, on my predictability, on my reluctance to disrupt, and I had reinforced it for years. This wasn't a realization that made me angry. It made me precise. Because once you see the role, you see its boundaries. You see what's expected of you and what will never be offered in return. I understood then that explaining myself wouldn't change anything. Neither would proving my memory nor revisiting old conversations. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. What unsettled me most was how calm I felt about this discovery. No surge of emotion, no urge to confront, just clarity. I began to test the role gently, not by refusing outright, but by pausing, by asking for details instead of filling in gaps automatically, by delaying responses, by letting small inconveniences remain unresolved unless someone explicitly addresses them. The reactions were immediate but subtle: confusion, mild irritation, comments about how things were easier before. No one asked what had changed. That told me everything. I wasn't valued for my presence, I was valued for my function. And as long as I performed it, no one needed to reflect on how they treated me. That was the moment I stopped waiting for fairness. Not because I no longer believed in it, but because I understood where it wouldn't come from. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't demand renegotiation. I simply began to withdraw internally while remaining outwardly the same: calm, polite, involved enough not to raise suspicion. What they didn't realize was that roles rely on unspoken agreements, and unspoken agreements can be dissolved quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. I had been assigned invisibility because I had mistaken peace for respect. That mistake wouldn't be repeated. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation, no dramatic line spoken aloud that would later replay in my head. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that it almost disappeared into the rest of that year. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, going through old bank records, not with any particular intention, just routine maintenance. I developed the habit of reviewing things periodically, not out of anxiety, but out of order. Numbers made sense. They didn't reinterpret themselves. When I reached the month of the transfer, I paused. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because seeing it again, time-stamped, precise, created a contrast that felt almost physical. There it was, the amount, the date, the confirmation. Undeniable. And suddenly, the weight of what had happened landed differently. It wasn't just that my parents had taken my savings and denied it. It was that they had done so knowing I wouldn't erupt, knowing I wouldn't humiliate them, knowing I'd try to resolve it privately, calmly, reasonably. They hadn't misjudged me. They'd counted on me. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal usually does. It steadied me, like a door closing somewhere behind my ribcage. I felt something settle into place, a boundary I hadn't consciously drawn before. I stopped asking why. Instead, I asked a more useful question. What does this tell me about how they see consequences? The answer was simple. They didn't see any. Not from me. And that's when the shift happened. Not outwardly, not in my behavior, but in my orientation. I stopped thinking in terms of repair. Up until that point, every internal calculation I'd made assumed reconciliation as the goal. Clarity, mutual understanding, a return to something resembling fairness. I had been moving within the emotional framework of someone who expected accountability to eventually surface. That expectation dissolved quietly. In its place came something calmer: acceptance. Not forgiveness, not resignation. Acceptance of the system I was operating in. Once I accepted that denial was a strategy, not a misunderstanding, I could stop trying to counter it with explanation. Once I accepted that my role depended on my silence, I could decide when silence served me instead. I remember closing my laptop and sitting still for a long time. No racing thoughts, no urge to call anyone. Just a sense of internal alignment I hadn't felt before. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to warn them. I didn't need to prove anything. I needed to reposition myself. From that day on, I treated information differently. I stopped offering it freely. I stopped narrating my thoughts. I stopped assuming that transparency would be met with good faith. I became selective. Conversations that once would have included context became shorter. Answers became accurate, but incomplete. I didn't lie. I just stopped volunteering. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. And it was invisible. If anyone noticed the change, they didn't name it, because naming it would require acknowledging that something had shifted, and that acknowledgement would lead uncomfortably close to responsibility. So life continued as before. But I didn't. That afternoon marked the end of something I'd carried quietly for years. The belief that if I stayed calm long enough, truth would defend itself. Truth doesn't defend itself. People do. And from that day on, I chose myself. Without announcement, without drama, without asking permission. Before that shift, my silence had been instinctive. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, because it kept things smooth, because I believed that not reacting was a form of maturity. I told myself I was choosing peace, even when peace came at my expense. After that day, silence became deliberate. The difference was subtle but profound. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally or sulking. I was observing, measuring, deciding what deserved my energy and what didn't. When conversations drifted toward assumptions about my time or resources, I didn't immediately fill the gap. I let the silence sit. I watched how quickly others rushed to cover it, who became uncomfortable, who tried to redirect. I learned a lot in those pauses. People are remarkably honest when they think you're still predictable. They continued to speak around me as if my agreement were implicit. They continued to make light comments about how easy I was. They continued to rely on my calm as if it were permanent infrastructure, something that didn't require maintenance. And because I wasn't reacting, they assumed nothing had changed. That was the advantage of being underestimated. I began to understand that silence can be read in two ways, as weakness or as control. Which one people choose depends on how invested they are in your compliance. They chose weakness. That misinterpretation gave me room. I started documenting things, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, amounts, statements made casually and then forgotten. I didn't store this information with the intent to confront. I stored it because clarity is a form of leverage, even if you never use it. Outwardly, I remained polite, available enough, present at family events. I didn't create distance that could be questioned. I didn't challenge narratives in real time. Inside, I was no longer participating in them. It surprised me how quickly the dynamic adapted, without me having to announce anything. When I didn't immediately agree, someone else stepped in. When I didn't volunteer, plans were made differently. Not better, just differently. And no one thanked me for all the times before. That absence of acknowledgement confirmed what I already knew. My silence had always been interpreted as consent, not generosity. Now that silence belonged to me. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when my mother made an offhand remark about my finances. Something assumptive. Something she wouldn't have said if she believed I might correct her. I didn't. I let it pass. Not because I agreed, but because I was no longer interested in adjusting their perception of me. Their assumptions were becoming useful. They revealed exactly how far they believed they could go. The more they underestimated me, the clearer my path became. This wasn't about strategy in a dramatic sense. There were no secret plans unfolding behind the scenes. It was about orientation, about no longer positioning myself as the emotional buffer between their behavior and its consequences. I stopped cushioning outcomes. If something was inconvenient, I let it be inconvenient. If something was unclear, I didn't rush to clarify it for everyone else. I allowed discomfort to exist without immediately neutralizing it. And still, no one asked me what was wrong, because the version of me they believed in didn't have a wrong. She absorbed, she adapted, she moved on. They didn't notice that I was still calm, but no longer accommodating. That was the miscalculation. Because silence, once chosen, is not emptiness. It's direction. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Not in an obvious way. I didn't suddenly become distant or cold. I didn't start asking pointed questions or correcting people mid-sentence. I stayed consistent enough to remain unremarkable. That consistency was intentional. Because when people believe you're unchanged, they stop filtering themselves. They speak freely, they reveal patterns, they repeat behaviors without checking whether they're being observed. I noticed everything. I noticed how often stories shifted depending on the audience, how details blurred when responsibility was inconvenient, but sharpened when praise was involved. I noticed how quickly my parents dismissed discomfort that wasn't theirs, and how carefully they managed their own. Most of all, I noticed how often they relied on time to do the work of erasure. If enough time passed, they assumed events would lose their shape. Those memories would soften. That certainty would become negotiable. And with me, that strategy had always worked, because I had never challenged it before. They didn't know I'd stopped forgetting. I began to organize my records, not just financial ones, but conversational patterns. I wrote down phrases that came up repeatedly. Deflections, minimizations, the subtle language used to make denial sound reasonable. You're misunderstanding. That's not what was meant. You're remembering it wrong. These weren't emotional reactions. They were tools, and tools are predictable. The more I documented, the calmer I became. Not because I was planning something dramatic, but because ambiguity was dissolving. There's a particular peace that comes from knowing you're not imagining things. Outwardly, my life stayed simple. Work, home, family gatherings. I didn't escalate, I didn't confront, I didn't hint at future consequences. That's why no one noticed when I started making structural changes. I separated my finances completely. Not just practically, but psychologically. I stopped treating my resources as shared by default. I updated beneficiaries. I reviewed documents I'd ignored before because they seemed unnecessary for someone like me. I learned the language of boundaries. Not the emotional kind, but the administrative kind. The kind that doesn't require explanations or debates. The kind that exists on paper. None of this felt vengeful. It felt adult. I was no longer responding to a hurt. I was responding to information. And the information was clear. People who deny reality don't change when confronted. They change when access is removed. They still saw me as compliant, still assumed my silence meant understanding, still believed that if anything truly bothered me, I'd say so. They mistook my restraint for passivity. What they didn't see was that I had stopped waiting for them to do the right thing. I had accepted that they wouldn't. That acceptance freed me from the need to convince, explain, or defend. I didn't need them to agree with my version of events. I only needed to ensure that my future no longer depended on their honesty. There's a strange power in being underestimated. It creates space. It lowers defenses. It allows preparation to happen in plain sight. While they continued rewriting the past, I was securing the future, and I didn't need to announce any of it, because the most effective changes are the ones that don't ask for permission and don't require recognition to work. The reveal didn't happen in a room full of people. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where someone finally admitted the truth. The clarity I gained was entirely private, and because of that, it was complete. It came while I was reviewing documents I'd never thought I'd need to look at so closely. Old emails, archived bank statements, records that had existed the entire time, quietly waiting for attention. I wasn't searching for vindication. I already knew what had happened. I was looking for alignment, and that's when I saw it clearly. Not just the transfer, but the pattern surrounding it. The timing, the language used in follow-up messages, the careful absence of written acknowledgement after the money changed hands. It wasn't accidental. They had avoided anything that created permanence. No text confirming repayment, no email outlining terms, no message that couldn't later be reframed as something else. That wasn't confusion. That was design. The realization didn't make my chest tighten or my stomach drop. It did the opposite. It simplified everything. I understood then that I had been dealing with people who relied on ambiguity as insulation, who believed that if nothing was recorded, nothing could be proven, and if nothing could be proven, nothing had to be accounted for. They weren't reckless. They were careful, and that told me exactly how to proceed. I didn't feel the urge to expose them. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, just a quiet recalibration of expectations. I had been operating under the assumption that shared history carried weight, that familial bonds created a baseline of honesty. That assumption was wrong, so I replaced it with something sturdier. I began treating every interaction as informational, not emotionally charged, just data. I noticed when they contradicted themselves, when timelines shifted, when phrasing softened around uncomfortable facts. I didn't correct them. I let the inconsistencies exist, because inconsistency only becomes dangerous when someone else is required to maintain it, and I had stopped doing that work for them. The most important part of this reveal wasn't about leverage in a dramatic sense. It was about the clarity of the terrain. I knew now that if accountability ever appeared, it would be accidental, not chosen. I knew that confronting them with proof would lead to deflection, not resolution. I knew that the version of events they needed to believe in was more important to them than repairing the relationship. And that knowledge made my next decision possible. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement. Hope had been the last thing tethering me to the idea that things might still resolve through conversation. Once that hope was gone, there was no urgency, no emotional pressure, only options. I remember sitting with that realization, feeling neither heavy nor light, just steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from finally understanding the rules of a game you didn't know you were playing. I didn't announce this understanding. I didn't hint at it. I didn't change my tone or my availability. They never knew there had been a reveal at all, because the most decisive moments often happen entirely inside us. Quiet, unobserved, and irreversible. Once everything was clear, I reached a point where not deciding became a decision in itself. Up until then, I had allowed things to remain unresolved, not out of fear, but because I was still orienting myself, observing, understanding, making sure I wasn't acting from hurt or impulse. But clarity creates pressure, not the kind that demands immediate action, but the kind that quietly asks, what are you going to do with what you know? I remember listing the options in my head, not emotionally, but practically. I could confront them with documentation, lay out dates, amounts, and records, force a conversation they couldn't easily deflect. That path might lead to partial acknowledgement, or it might harden their denial. Either way, it would entangle me emotionally again. It would require energy, repetition, and the willingness to be cast as difficult. I could let it go entirely, accept the loss, emotionally and financially, and preserve the appearance of harmony. That would cost me less in the short term, but it would confirm the role I had been assigned. It would teach them, once again, that access to me came without consequence. Or I could choose something else, something quieter, something irreversible. I could stop participating in a system that depended on my silence and restructure my life so that their version of events no longer mattered. That option didn't require confrontation. It didn't require agreement. It didn't require them to ever admit anything. It only required consistency. That was the option I chose. Not because it was clever, but because it was clean. I decided that I would no longer invest in outcomes that depended on their honesty. I would no longer build plans that assumed accountability might appear later. I would stop positioning myself as someone who could be relied on without reciprocity. This decision wasn't announced. There was no dramatic internal monologue where I declared independence. It was simply a shift in how I allocated trust. Trust, I realized, is a resource. And like any resource, it should be distributed where it's respected. I didn't cut them off, I didn't escalate, I didn't punish. I withdrew reliance. From that point on, my future decisions would not include them as safeguards. I didn't ask their advice on financial matters. I didn't share plans that could later be questioned or reinterpreted. I didn't assume support, emotional or otherwise. I built redundancy instead. This was the irreversible part. Once you stop depending on someone to be fair, you stop being vulnerable to their denial. And once that dependency is gone, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. They didn't notice the decision in real time. From the outside, nothing looked different. I was still present, still polite, still calm. If anything, I seemed easier, less reactive, less invested. That was the irony. They mistook my disengagement from the emotional economy as acceptance. But acceptance isn't the same as participation. This decision didn't make me feel powerful in a dramatic sense. It made me feel grounded. Like I was standing on something solid for the first time in a long while. I wasn't waiting for the truth to be acknowledged anymore. I was building around its absence. Once the decision was made, there was nothing urgent to do. That's something people misunderstand about quiet change. They expect movement to be visible. Announcements, boundaries drawn out loud, consequences delivered in real time. What followed instead was administrative. I didn't alter my behavior dramatically. I altered my infrastructure. I reviewed every area of my life where assumptions had replaced consent. Finances were the most obvious, but not the only one. I updated accounts, changed access, simplified anything that still relied on verbal understandings or shared memory. None of this required confrontation. The paper doesn't argue. Systems don't gaslight. Structures don't reinterpret themselves. That's why I chose them. I separated what had once been informally shared. I reduced overlap. I made sure that anything important existed in writing, even if no one else ever saw it. I didn't do this out of suspicion. I did it out of respect for reality. I also adjusted my availability, not by disappearing, but by becoming specific. I stopped being generally helpful and became situationally cooperative. If someone asked directly and clearly, I answered. If they hinted, I didn't fill in the blanks. That single change had more impact than I expected. People who rely on your predictability feel disoriented when it disappears, even if you haven't technically refused anything. Plans slowed down. Expectations had to be clarified. Responsibility shifted. And still no one named it, because naming it would require acknowledging that my default compliance had been doing work for them all along. I continued documenting, not because I expected to use it, but because documentation keeps you honest. It prevents you from rewriting your own experience to make things easier. There were moments when I felt the temptation to explain, to say this is why I'm doing things differently, to offer clarity in the hope that it might create understanding. I didn't. Understanding wasn't the goal anymore. Stability was. I let time do what confrontation would not. I let new patterns establish themselves quietly. I allowed others to adapt, or not, without rushing to soften the process. They began to feel the absence before they understood it. Small things stopped happening automatically. Help wasn't assumed. Emotional labor wasn't preloaded. If something required coordination, someone had to take responsibility for it. From their perspective, things became slightly harder. From mine, they became sustainable. And because nothing explosive occurred, there was nothing to argue against. No single moment they could point to and say, this is when she changed. No event is dramatic enough to demand a response. I moved in silence, not because I was afraid of reaction, but because reaction was irrelevant. The goal was not to be heard. The goal was to be unaffected. By the time the consequences began to surface, the systems were already in place. And systems once established don't reverse themselves just because someone is uncomfortable. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They didn't arrive with an argument, or a phone call, or even a tense silence at the dinner table. They arrived the same way my withdrawal had, quietly, incrementally, and without explanation. At first, it felt almost imaginary. A detail slipped through the cracks. Something small that I would normally have noticed, handled, and resolved before it ever reached anyone else. This time it didn't. It sat there, unfinished. No one mentioned it immediately. People assumed it would resolve itself, the way things always had. That assumption had been built over the years. It didn't disappear just because I stopped reinforcing it. Then another small thing stalled, and another. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that could be pointed to as a failure. Just a growing sense that things weren't flowing the way they used to. I noticed the shift before anyone else because I knew exactly what had been removed. It wasn't an effort. It wasn't kindness. It was anticipation. I had always been the one who noticed what was about to become inconvenient and intervened early, quietly, without recognition. I smoothed logistics. I clarified misunderstandings before they hardened. I carried emotional weight so others could stay comfortable. Without that invisible labor, reality started showing up unfiltered. At first, they blamed circumstances. People were tired, busy, distracted. Life was complicated, after all. That explanation worked for a while, but as the friction continued, it became harder to dismiss. Plans required more discussion. Decisions took longer. Emotions escalated more quickly. The buffer was gone, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. I stayed exactly the same on the surface. I showed up, I listened, I responded politely when addressed directly. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that could be interpreted as hostility. What I withdrew was automatic responsibility. If someone asked clearly, I answered clearly. If they hinted, I waited. If they assumed, I let the assumptions sit unanswered. That alone changed the rhythm of everything. There was a moment when someone said lightly, I thought you were handling that, and I replied just as lightly, oh, I didn't realize that was mine. No accusation, no defensiveness, just a statement of fact. The silence that followed was brief, but telling. That was new. They weren't used to hearing me disidentify from tasks that had quietly become mine by default. It forced a recalibration, even if they didn't consciously acknowledge it. From then on, confusion started surfacing more openly. Someone forgot to follow up. Someone else assumed someone else had taken care of it. Minor issues grew teeth because no one intercepted them early. Small stresses accumulated instead of being diffused. And with that came irritability, not directed at me yet, but at the situation, at each other, at the sense that something was off without anyone being able to say what. I watched this unfold with a strange mixture of calm and recognition. This wasn't chaos, this was redistribution. The emotional and logistical weight I'd been carrying hadn't disappeared. It had simply dropped back into the system, and the system didn't know how to hold it. There were moments when I felt the old reflex rise in me, the instinct to step in, to smooth things over, to prevent discomfort before it becomes visible. That instinct was strong, not because I wanted approval, but because I had been trained to equate ease with safety. Watching tension linger without intervening felt unnatural at first, almost irresponsible. But I reminded myself of something important. I wasn't creating the discomfort. I was just no longer preventing it. That distinction mattered. As weeks passed, the unease sharpened. Conversations grew more careful. People seemed slightly on edge, as if waiting for something to happen, or for someone to fix what they couldn't articulate. There were attempts to reestablish the old dynamic. They were subtle, a warmer tone than usual. A casual comment about how we've always worked well together. A suggestion that maybe things had been easier before and could be again. I didn't reject these overtures. I simply didn't respond with action. Warmth without responsibility changed nothing. Nostalgia without accountability had no leverage. What they wanted, though they never said it, was the return of my unquestioned participation. They wanted the system restored without examining what it had cost me. And that wasn't on offer anymore. I noticed something else during this time, how quickly discomfort turns into narrative. When people don't understand a loss, they create explanations that protect their self-image. I could feel that process beginning. The subtle shift from confusion to quiet irritation. The search for a reason that didn't require self-reflection. Comments became slightly sharper. Not cruel, just edged. Remarks about how I seemed less involved lately, how I was harder to read, how things felt different but no one could say why. I didn't correct those narratives. Correction would have pulled me back into emotional labor, explaining, reassuring, justifying. It would have invited debate about my tone, rather than reflection on their behavior. Instead, I stayed steady, calm, consistent, unmoved. That steadiness was unsettling, because people expect withdrawal to look like anger. When it doesn't, they struggle to respond. There's nothing to push against, nothing to argue with. The consequences continued to unfold quietly. Decisions that once relied on my input now expose fault lines between others. Emotional support that I used to provide was suddenly missing, and people felt it, not as a loss, but as a strain. I watched relationships around me become slightly more brittle. Conversations required more effort, tolerance wore thinner. And still, no one connected it back to me, because doing so would require acknowledging that I had been carrying something essential, and that they had benefited from not noticing. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, there was a growing sense of instability. Not dramatic, but persistent, like walking on a surface that used to feel solid and now felt uncertain. I knew then that the point of no return had passed, not because I had done something aggressive, but because the system had already adapted to my absence. Even if I stepped back in, it wouldn't erase what had been revealed. They had learned, unconsciously, what life felt like without my constant buffering. And I'd learned something even more important. I could remain kind without being consumed, present without being available, calm without being compliant. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They lived, and they were only just beginning. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already behind it. Not behind in information, but behind in timing. The discomfort that had been floating vaguely in the background finally sharpened into concern. Not concern for me or for what had happened, but for the instability they could no longer ignore. Things weren't just harder now, they were unreliable. That unsettled them. I noticed the change in tone before the content changed. Conversations slowed down. Questions became more careful. There was a hesitancy that hadn't been there before, as if they were trying to locate the edge of something they couldn't see. They began revisiting the past, but selectively. Not the denial, not the money, not the moment things broke. Instead, they reminisced about how close we used to be, how well we worked together, how much they valued family unity. The language softened, rounded out, stripped of specifics. It was an attempt at repair that avoided accountability. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge the framing. I didn't offer reassurance. Because reassurance would have implied that repair was still possible on the same terms. It wasn't. They were trying to restore comfort without addressing the cause, to rewind the dynamic without acknowledging why it had shifted. That might have worked once, years earlier, when I was still willing to absorb contradiction in the name of peace. But that version of me no longer existed. There was a moment, quiet, almost tentative, when my mother asked if something was wrong. Not directly, not clearly, just enough to open a door without committing to walking through it. I considered my response carefully. I could have explained. I could have summarized years of dismissal in a few careful sentences. I could have named the money, the denial, the gaslighting. But an explanation would have done one thing very clearly. It would have placed the burden of repair back on me. If I explained, I would have been responsible for how they reacted, for soothing defensiveness, for navigating denial, for managing the emotional fallout of their discomfort. I chose not to. I answered honestly, but minimally. I've just been doing things differently, I said. What works for me now? That was all. The pause that followed was heavy. Not because I'd said something wrong, but because I hadn't given them anything to negotiate with, no details to reinterpret, no emotions to manage. They tried again later. Different phrasing, different day, the same underlying hope that if they could just understand what had changed, they could adjust enough to restore the old balance. But the old balance required my silence, and silence was no longer something I offered for free. Their attempts grew more urgent, but also more vague. Concern mixed with frustration, confusion edged toward irritation. Why wouldn't I just say what was wrong? Why was I being so distant, without explanation? They framed it as a communication problem. It wasn't. It was a consequence problem. They wanted a conversation that would allow them to feel better without changing behavior. I wanted a structure that didn't depend on their honesty. Those two goals were incompatible. By the time they realized that something had permanently shifted, that this wasn't a phase or stress or miscommunication, it was already too late to undo it. Not because I was punishing them, but because I had already rebuilt my life in a way that didn't require their acknowledgement. There was nothing left to negotiate. The systems were in place. The boundaries were quiet but firm. My expectations had been recalibrated beyond their reach. They sensed the finality before they understood it. That's often how it happens. People realize too late that access was a privilege, not a guarantee. And once it's restructured rather than revoked, there's no dramatic moment to argue against. Just a new reality. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't planned. There was no build-up, no speech rehearsed in my head, no emotional pressure pushing it forward. It happened because all the softer options had been exhausted, and because silence at that point would have been misread as permission. It took place in a familiar setting, neutral, uncharged, the kind of environment where voices don't naturally rise. That mattered to me. I wasn't there to win an argument, I was there to close a loop. They asked directly this time. Not tentatively, not indirectly, directly. Why had I changed? The question was framed as concern, but there was urgency beneath it. A need to reestablish footing, to understand where the ground had shifted. I didn't rush to answer. I let the pause exist, not as a tactic, but as a signal that I was choosing my words with care. When I spoke, I kept my tone even. I realized I needed to handle things differently, I said, because some things that mattered to me were dismissed. I didn't name specifics immediately. I watched their faces, the subtle tightening, the readiness to respond. They asked what I meant, so I told them, calmly, briefly, without detail that could be debated. I mentioned the money, the agreement, as I understood it, the denial that followed. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for an apology. I stated facts. The response was immediate. Confusion, minimization, a suggestion that I might be remembering things incorrectly. It would have unsettled me once. This time it didn't. I didn't correct every detail. I didn't try to prove my memory. I didn't escalate when the framing shifted. Instead, I said something simple. I'm not asking you to agree with me, I said. I'm telling you how I've adjusted as a result. That sentence changed the energy in the room. Because it removed the possibility of debate, there was nothing to refute, nothing to reinterpret. I wasn't asking them to see it my way. I was informing them that their actions had consequences, regardless of their acknowledgement. They grew quiet, not reflective, unsettled. They tried to soften it then, to talk about misunderstandings, about intentions, about how families shouldn't keep score. I listened, and when they finished, I said, I'm not keeping score, I'm keeping myself steady. That was the end of it. No dramatic exit, no final demand, just a clear statement of position. I didn't feel relief afterward. I felt closure, because confrontation isn't about volume, it's about clarity. And clarity doesn't require permission. They didn't apologize. I hadn't expected them to. What mattered was that the dynamic had been named, and that I had done so without sacrificing my composure or my ground. I left knowing that whatever came next wouldn't depend on their understanding. And that was enough. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not smaller. If anything, I take up space more honestly. Not by speaking louder or asserting myself constantly, but by no longer folding myself to fit into roles that were never meant to be mutual. I used to believe that strength looked like endurance, like staying calm no matter what, like absorbing discomfort so others could remain at ease. That belief shaped my identity for a long time, and it earned me praise. What it didn't earn me was safety. Now I understand that composure without boundaries is just availability, and availability, when it's unexamined, becomes entitlement for the people who benefit from it. I still value calm, I still choose restraint, but it's no longer reflexive, it's intentional, and intention changes everything. My life is simpler in ways that aren't immediately visible. Fewer explanations, fewer assumptions, fewer emotional cleanups that no one notices until they're gone. I don't manage other people's comfort the way I used to, and that has given me a kind of quiet freedom. I no longer feel the need to be understood by the people who dismissed me. Understanding is a gift, not a prerequisite for my stability. I'm careful now about where I invest energy, trust, and openness. That care isn't bitterness, it's discernment. My relationship with my parents exists in a different shape. Polite, limited, realistic. I don't expect from them what they've already shown they won't provide. That adjustment wasn't sad, it was clarifying. Expectation, I've learned, is where most pain hides. I've stopped explaining my choices to people who benefit from misunderstanding them. I've stopped offering transparency as proof of goodwill. I've stopped waiting for acknowledgement to legitimize my experience. Instead, I rely on alignment. Does this choice support my stability? Does this conversation respect my reality? Does this dynamic require me to disappear to function? If the answer is no, I don't force it to work. That doesn't mean I've closed myself off. It means I've become precise about where I open. There's a difference. I still keep that small leather notebook, not because I'm guarding against betrayal, but because writing things down reminds me that my experience has weight, even when no one else validates it. I trust myself now. That might sound simple, but it's the most significant change of all. Trusting myself means I don't need to convince others of what I know. I don't need to replay conversations or defend memories. I don't need to chase resolution from people who rely on denial. I've learned that dignity doesn't come from being treated well. It comes from refusing to abandon yourself when you aren't. And that, more than anything, defines who I am now. There's no final twist to this story, no apology that changed everything, no moment where the past was corrected, reimbursed, or rewritten in a way that made it fair. If you're listening for justice in the form of admission or remorse, this story doesn't offer that. What it offers instead is something quieter and more durable. I didn't get my parents to admit what they did. I didn't get validation for my memory. I didn't get the kind of closure that depends on someone else's growth. What I got was autonomy, and that turned out to matter more. For a long time, I believed that closure came from being understood, from having your pain acknowledged by the people who caused it. I thought that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, calmly enough, truth would eventually be recognized. But some people don't deny because they're confused. They deny because acknowledgement would require accountability. Once I understood that, I stopped chasing explanations and started protecting outcomes. The real shift wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped measuring my well-being by whether others agreed with me. I stopped offering access to people who relied on my silence. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. What replaced those habits wasn't anger or withdrawal. It was clarity. Clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept. Clarity about where my responsibility ended. Clarity about the cost of staying quiet when quiet is mistaken for consent. If there's a moral here, it's not cut people off or never trust anyone. It's simpler than that and harder to practice. Your memory matters, even when it's inconvenient. Your calm does not obligate you to absorb harm. And silence, when chosen consciously, can be a form of self-respect, not surrender. You don't need to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You don't need permission to restructure your life. You don't need to be loud to be final. Sometimes the most honest justice is withdrawing from systems that depend on your erasure and building something that no longer requires you to disappear. If this story resonated with you, not in the details but in the pattern, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment you finally regained control?